When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak. Well, that's a quote from wild woman poet Audre Lorde, and that's my way of welcoming you back to Dale Byron's Poetry Podcast, and this, our second in a series entitled In Praise of Wild Women Poets, and we're probably going to do at least 3 of these before we're done because we have so many amazing poets to choose from. And we are going to start today with this particular episode, which is the 8th, by the way, in this podcast series. So I am thrilled that you're here with me, and if there are other episodes that you haven't heard, you can check those out at your leisure, as they say. So I want to start with a poem by Adrienne Rich, who belongs in this group of poets that we're talking about, these wild women poets. And this is a poem called Power. This is how it goes. Living in the earth deposits of our history, today, a backhoe divulged out of a crumbling flank of earth, one bottle, amber perfect, 100-year-old cure for fever or melancholy, a tonic. For living on this earth in the winters of this climate. Today, I was reading about Marie Curie. She must have known she suffered from radiation sickness, her body bombarded for years by the element she purified. It seems she denied to the end the source of the cataracts on her eyes, the cracked and suppurating skin of her finger ends, till she could no longer hold a test tube or a pencil. She died a famous woman denying her wounds came from the same source as her power. She died a famous woman denying her wounds came from the same source as her power. Now, I wanted to start with a quote after that poem by Adrienne Rich. I wanted to start with a quote by another amazing woman who, as it turns out, loved poetry, a woman named Cheryl Strayed. And you may recognize that name because she wrote an amazing popular book called Wild about her own adventures. And it actually became a movie. But this is a quote about Adrienne Rich from Cheryl Strayed. She said, Adrienne Rich did not die a woman who denied that her wounds came from the same source as her power. In fact, she spent her life making power from those wounds. But Marie Curie didn't have that luxury. She had to deny that in order to be who she was in her time. But we don't. And I think so much of the work I've done and the work I hope I continue to do is about writing into those wounds. Well, I thought this quote from Cheryl Strayed was particularly relevant to our Wild Woman Poets theme. And remember, we talked last week a little bit about there's so many different characteristics of these poets, but we talked about three in particular. One is that they are courageous, and that means core, heart, to follow our heart. They were courageous. Two, they were connected. They were connected to themselves, to others, and many of them in particular writing about the natural world, their connection to others. So they were connected, self to others and to other, the great other. And then third is their creative capacity, which is a kind of constant reaching out to the muse, inviting the muse in. Now, what's interesting, talking about Cheryl Strayed, who again was making, I think, some very insightful comments about Adrienne Rich and her poetry, this poem in particular, about Marie Curie. And about Cheryl, someone said, "Stories are a meal," one wise father told his 8-year-old daughter a long time ago. But poetry is a glass of water, perhaps even a single drop that will save your life. That's precisely what poetry became for Cheryl Strayed as she hiked 1,000 miles on the Pacific Crest Trail to put herself in the way of truth and beauty in a thoroughly transformative experience that, as we just mentioned before, became the magnificent memoir Wild, that then became a very popular motion picture. Now, in talking about this particular first poem that we're working with, called Power, Roseanne Cash also loves this poem, I found out in doing my research. And she related it to a story or a quote about her own brain surgery, and she had a debilitating challenge. And she said, persist and verify. The power that we abdicate to others out of our insecurity, to others who insult us with their faux intuition or their authoritarian, smugness that comes back to hurt us so deeply. But the power we wrest from our certitude, that saves us. And again, all of these quotes and the poem itself that we just celebrated by Adrienne Rich, I think are all in this sweet spot of celebrating wild women poets. Now, this next poem, we're really going to be switching gears, and this happens to be a local poet, because we were talking about Santa Cruz just a moment ago, and now we want to talk about Healdsburg and Sonoma County, which is just to the north of where I am as I record this, because that's where the poet Penelope LaMontagne was from. And she wrote a poem that I love, which is called Somewhere There Is Healing. Somewhere There Is a Healing. At water's edge, a green glass bottle smashed on a rock, a small act of war against all things living. She collects the shards, thinking of a raccoon, the tracks nearby, those soft pads, carrying them down to wash their food in the dark. Children pushing off on doughy feet as they run to the river. The little mound of rage puts them all in peril. She makes a bowl of her hand and fills it with the glass, each little bayonet dormant and dangerous. She senses the hand that did this, She senses the hand that did this, striking out from a do not enter heart, a shadowy, slivered thing, she imagines. In her mind's eye, she pieces the vessel together, making a jigsaw heart, one not so very different from her own. A drop of blood forms between her fingers and disappears into the thirsty sand. She cradles her cargo. She cradles her cargo, and back at the house over the trash, she arches her blood-stained palm and lets a handful of hate fall away. When I first read this poem, at least a decade ago, I think more, I thought, what an amazing description of being able to put oneself into someone else's position, into their shoes, as the old cliche goes, into their body, even into their heart, to recognize that an act such as this, which could be potentially hurtful to others, to people and kids and critters, that act actually was in response to a heart that had been hurt. You know, there's an expression that I have thought of over the years a lot, and it is that hurt people hurt people. And I think this poem gets to that so brilliantly. So brilliantly. There was a quote that this poet once said. She said, Penelope once wrote, "Perhaps the only way to transfer a wee worm of hope to another human being is to go out of your way to do a kindness for another, a split-second extension of heart to hand or voice." This is, again, for me, an amazing poem. And when she gets down toward the end of the poem and says that she pieces the vessel together, making a jigsaw heart, one not so very different from her own. A drop of blood forms between her fingers and disappears into the thirsty sand. She cradles her cargo, and back at the house over the trash, she arches her blood-stained palm and lets a handful of hate fall away. Now, how much do you imagine we need this kind of effort in the world to deal with the handfuls of hate, and what courage it takes to be able to do that? This poet once said, I once heard, as a quote from her, I once heard Brenda Hillman give a craft lecture in which she described a title as a geographical site. I have never forgotten Brenda Hillman about writing, of course. I once heard Brenda Hillman give a craft lecture in which she described a title as a geographical site. I have never forgotten that. It made me review the titles of all of my poems and change some of them. I now want the title to be something you can stand on and something that stands by itself. The title has its own weather, which may be different but related to the body of the work. Sometimes the title is so important that I start with only that and build. A book title, when it comes to me, tells me that the work is ready to be born, its completion imminent. Again, Penelope La Montagne, originally from Healdsburg, and I should say that she had an amazing group of friends. She actually passed in 2018, so just a few years ago, born in 1948. And at her celebration memorial, I found these words that came from that. In loving memory, May 26, 1948 to March 23, 2018, she wove her magic into us. She wove her magic into us beneath her flourishing wings. Amazing poet. So let's now go far, far from Sonoma, California, and let's go all the way to Russia, later in her life, the Soviet Union. And we're going to talk about a Russian poet, Anna Akhmatova. And this is a poem called In Human Closeness. In Human Closeness. And the translation is by a translator whose last name is Bonver, Bonver. The poem goes like this. In human closeness, there is a secret edge. Nor love nor passion can pass it above. Let lips with lips be joined in silent rage, and hearts be burst asunder with the love. And friendship, too, is powerless plot. And so years of bliss with noble tends, when your heart is free and known not the slow languor of the earthy sense. And they who strive to reach this edge are mad, but they who reached are shocked with anguish hard. Now you know why beneath your hand you do not feel the beating of my heart. And they who strive to reach this edge are mad, but they who reached are shocked with anguish hard. Now you know why beneath your hand you do not feel the beating of my heart. Now there is a poem that in my mind captures the fierceness of a relationship, a loving relationship at some point, that has now blown up, has now ended. I mean, I was thinking to myself that someone could use standard language to end a relationship, or you could, as this wild woman poet did, you could craft a poem that has some amazing images in it, and you could speak that poem the way even the first stanza sort of sets the tone and the scene, as it were. In human closeness there is a secret edge, nor love nor passion can pass it above. Let lips with lips be joined in silent rage, and hearts be burst asunder with the love. Ooh, and then, of course, the way she ends the poem, short poem, but the way she ends it. And they who strive to reach this edge and maybe go beyond it, I don't know, to reach this edge are mad, but they who reached are shocked with anguish hard. Now you know why beneath your hand you do not feel the beating of my heart. Whoa. That just gives you a chill right off the bat. Now you know why beneath your hand you do not feel the beating of my heart. Also kind of gives you a sense of that the relationship maybe was amazing and wild and passionate at one time. So Anna Akhmatova was one of the most significant Russian poets of the 20th century. She was shortlisted for the Nobel Prize in 1965 and received second most nominations for the award the following year. She was born during the Russian Empire, so this is before the Bolshevik Revolution, but she lived through all of those difficult times, the end of the Russian Empire and the early days of the Soviet Union. She lived through being, her work was disavowed and was not available. She lived through that and lived into a time which she was able to work and write again. Many years she had to hide everything that she was doing. So Anna Akhmatova had a lot of fierce, difficult times in her life, in addition to the amazing art that she did. And in looking at her work and again, an amazing body of work, and what a, just a fierce spirit she was. Here's a quote from her. She said, "Your voice is wild and simple. Your voice is wild and simple. You are untranslatable into any one tongue." Anna Akhmatova. She also says, "Song falls silent, music is dumb, but the air burns with their fragrance, and white winter on its knees observes everything with reverent attention." Wow. I mean, how much more can you get in that many few words? The poet William Stafford used to say, poems are just words that got lucky. It's like lucky language. And this language is so amazing to me for what is contained in that very small economic number of words. Song falls silent. Song falls silent. Music is dumb, but the air burns with their fragrance, and white winter on its knees observes everything with reverent attention. Ah, you just want to be in her world. And this is one, I think I teased this one last episode. I'm pretty sure this is the one I teased. It's worth repeating. You will hear thunder and remember me. You will hear thunder and remember me. And think. She wanted storms. She wanted storms. The rim of the sky will be the color of hard crimson. And your heart, as it was then, will be on fire. What an artist. What amazing work with language, What amazing art she did. And one more Anna Akhmatova quote from one of her poems. Why is it that you still beguile me? Why is it that you still beguile me as wind, stone, bird, and all the likes? Why is that you smile on me? Why is that you smile on me with sudden summer lightning strikes? You just begin to see how much passion we imagine was in her life and how much she was able to pull together and translate into her poetry. Okay, Anna Akhmatova, wild woman poet extraordinaire. Okay. So I'm going to tease next week. We're going to do one more session on wild women poets. I just have to tell you, I mentioned in the episode last time, I mentioned that I had done a series of these courses and lectures on wild women poets. So, and that was a group that I had already, winnowed down to a smaller group. So I've got a number of poets, and one that we'll deal with next week, though, in the final of these three episodes on wild women poets is, of course, Mary Oliver. And this is a quote. We'll just tease with a quote from an essay of hers. And of course, she left us. She passed just a few years ago, but she left us so many stars in the sky to remember her by. Okay. She said it like this. This is what I learned, that the world's otherness is antidote to confusion, that standing within this otherness, the beauty and the mystery of the world, out in the fields or deep inside books, can re-dignify the worst stung heart. Oh, that's amazing. How she talked about being out in the natural world, which most of her poems were set in the natural world. We'll talk about all this next time, but it's amazing how few people she had in her poems. It was all about the natural world, and yet every poem she wrote was a message to we human beings. More on that. So stay tuned for that one in about 10, 11 days or so for the next episode. Now that's a wrap, but we need to, it's a funny word, isn't it? We need to and we want to. I would like to end with the way we started, with that Audre Lorde quote. When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak. Audre Lorde. Okay, again, that is a wrap. So I would love it if you would put a comment wherever you get this podcast. Put a comment there if you feel so inclined. You can rate the podcast on Apple or, again, wherever you get it. I also wanted to mention that one little new thing is that I have put and will continue to put all of these podcasts up on YouTube. If that is a place that is easier for you to listen to these, or yes, if you want to listen to them on YouTube, they're there. All you got to do is search for my name and Dale Byron's Poetry Podcast, and you will find these podcasts on YouTube. Okay, there you go. Until next podcast, it's very important, my request. Please take good care of yourself.